It began as every parent's nightmare and quickly spiraled into one of America's most unforgettable crimes. On the night of October 25, 1994, Susan Smith, a young mother from the small town of Union, South Carolina, appeared on live television. With her face streaked in tears, she begged for the safe return of her two sons, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex. Her words echoed the fear of every parent. She claimed a stranger had forced his way into her car at a red light, held her at gunpoint, and driven away with her children still strapped into their seats. The nation rallied around her. Yellow ribbons appeared on trees, candlelight vigils were held, and news outlets plastered the smiling faces of the two missing boys across every screen. Even the FBI was called in as a massive manhunt unfolded. Susan and her estranged husband David became the faces of tragedy, pleading before cameras for the lives of their children. But as investigators combed through Susan's account, troubling details began to surface. Her description of the supposed carjacker was strangely vague. Her emotions during interviews seemed inconsistent, and when subjected to polygraph tests, she failed them. Detectives quietly shifted their focus from an imagined stranger in the night to the grieving mother herself. Behind closed doors, Susan's life painted a very different picture than the one she showed on camera. She had been entangled in a relationship with a wealthy local man, a man who had recently ended their affair with a letter spelling out his intentions clearly. He did not want children. For Susan, her sons, the center of national prayers and sympathy, had become obstacles to the life she thought she deserved. On the 9th day of the search, investigators confronted Susan. Sheriff Howard Wells sat her down and gently told her, "We know there was no carjacker." At that moment, her carefully built facade cracked. With nowhere left to run, Susan broke down and confessed to an unthinkable truth. There had been no kidnapping, no stranger with a gun. On that October night, Susan had driven to the dark edge of John D. Long Lake. She stepped out of her car, released the handbrake, and stood as the vehicle slowly rolled into the water, her two sons trapped inside. For 9 long days, while a nation tied ribbons and prayed, Susan Smith already knew the fate of her children. They were gone, drowned in the very car that search teams had been scouring the state to find. This revelation would transform what seemed like a random act of violence into one of the most infamous betrayals of maternal trust in American history. On November 3rd, Long Lake located Susan Smith's Mazda, submerged in just 18 feet of water. As the vehicle was pulled from the murky depths, the heartbreaking truth was revealed. Inside were the bodies of 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex, still strapped into their car seats. What had been a story of hope and prayer instantly shifted into a story of betrayal and horror. The recovery shocked a nation that had tied yellow ribbons, held candlelight vigils, and wept for 2 missing children. For 9 days, Susan Smith had accepted the sympathy of millions while knowing all along that her boys were beneath the waters of that lake. Investigators now had the grim evidence to pair with the motive they had already uncovered. Just days before the boys disappeared, Susan had received a breakup letter from Tom Findlay, the wealthy man she desperately wanted. In that letter, he told her plainly, he had no interest in being with a woman who came with the responsibility of children. For Susan, Michael and Alex had become obstacles to the life she envisioned, and in her cold calculation, removing them meant freedom. The trial that followed was a media spectacle. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, portraying Susan as manipulative, selfish, and willing to fabricate a racist lie about a phantom carjacker to cover her crime. They argued she had not acted in desperation but in cruel premeditation. The defense countered with a portrait of a profoundly troubled young woman. They laid bare Susan's history of depression, a previous suicide attempt, and years of sexual abuse by her stepfather. They argued that she was not a calculating killer, but a broken woman whose mental collapse drove her to the unthinkable. In July 1995, the jury reached its decision. Susan Smith was guilty of 2 counts of murder. But instead of execution, they handed her a life sentence, sparing her from the death penalty after considering her traumatic past. Susan became eligible for parole in November 2024, a development that reignited public fury. Petition after petition poured in, demanding she remain behind bars, with many insisting that the enormity of her betrayal meant she should never walk free. As of August 2025, Susan Smith is 53 years old and incarcerated at Leith Correctional Institution in South Carolina. The name that once drew national sympathy is now remembered as one of the darkest symbols of maternal betrayal in American history. On the night of May 19, 1983, a blood-spattered Nissan Pulsar pulled up to the emergency entrance of Mackenzie Willamette Hospital in Springfield, Oregon. Behind the wheel was 27-year-old Diane Downs. In the back seat were her 3 children, 7-year-old Cheryl, 8-year-old Christy, and 3-year-old Danny, all gravely wounded by gunfire. Cheryl was already gone, while Christy and Danny were fighting for their lives. Diane herself had a superficial gunshot wound to her forearm. She told doctors and police a chilling story. A bushy-haired stranger had flagged her down on a dark rural road, attempted to carjack her, and then opened fire on her family before disappearing into the night. It should have been every parent's worst nightmare, a random act of roadside terror. But almost immediately, something about Diane's demeanor didn't sit right. Witnesses described her as oddly calm, even flirtatious, in the hospital halls while her children were in surgery. She laughed and joked with staff. Her biggest concern seemed less about her children's condition and more about contacting Robert Knickerbocker, a married man in Arizona with whom she was obsessed. Police quickly learned from her diaries that Diane was fixated on Robert, writing pages about her desire to be with him, and her frustration that he didn't want the responsibility of children. Investigators began piecing together a disturbing possibility. The gunman Diane described didn't exist. The motive, they suspected, was that her own children were the obstacle keeping her from the man she desperately wanted. As Christy slowly recovered from a stroke caused by her injuries, doctors and prosecutors prayed she might eventually be able to tell them what really happened that night. Until then, suspicion grew heavier around Diane Downs, the young mother whose story was falling apart one contradiction at a time. The trial of Diane Downs in 1984 became one of the most sensational courtroom dramas of its time. Prosecutors argued she had staged the roadside ambush to rid herself of her children, all to clear a path for a relationship with Robert Knickerbocker. But what transformed suspicion into certainty was the voice of a child. 8-year-old Christy Downs, who had survived a stroke after being shot, was the state's most fragile and vital witness. After months of therapy, she regained enough strength to testify. When asked in court, "Who shot you?" her answer was simple and devastating: "My mom." That single statement pierced through every excuse Diane had offered and sealed the case in the eyes of the jury. Diane, meanwhile, played the role of a defiant and theatrical defendant. She arrived in court pregnant with another man's child, seemingly hoping to portray herself as nurturing and maternal in front of the jurors. But the strategy backfired. Instead of sympathy, it underscored the prosecution's narrative of her obsession with men and her willingness to discard anyone, even her children, who stood in the way of what she wanted. The jury found her guilty of 1 count of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. But the story didn't end there. Today, Diane Downs remains incarcerated. She has been denied parole multiple times, continuing to insist she is innocent and still blaming the mythical, bushy-haired stranger for the shooting. Her case remains a chilling study of maternal betrayal, and of a courtroom brought to silence by the testimony of a child who pointed to her own mother as the one who pulled the trigger. To neighbors in Clear Lake, Texas, Andrea Yates seemed like a devoted stay-at-home mother. She and her husband, Rusty, had built what looked like a modest but happy life together. Rusty worked as an engineer for NASA, while Andrea homeschooled their 5 children: Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and baby Mary. From the outside, it was the image of a wholesome family rooted in faith and routine. But beneath the surface, Andrea was fighting a losing battle with her mind. After the birth of each child, her mental health worsened. She suffered from severe postpartum depression, spiraling into postpartum psychosis, a condition that blurred the line between delusion and reality. Doctors repeatedly warned the couple that having more children could be catastrophic, but those warnings went unheeded. By the time Mary was born, Andrea's grip on reality had nearly disintegrated. She began hearing voices, convinced she was a failed mother and that Satan himself was inside her. Twisted by these delusions, she came to believe that her children were doomed to eternal damnation unless she took drastic action to save their souls. On June 20th, 2001, Rusty left for work, unaware of what was about to unfold. Alone in the house, Andrea carried out a methodical and horrifying plan. One by one, she led her children into the bathroom and drowned them in the bathtub. The youngest went first. When her eldest son, Noah, realized what was happening and tried to run, Andrea chased him through the house, dragged him back, and forced him under the water. When it was over, 5 small bodies lay lifeless, their futures erased by the very person meant to protect them. Andrea calmly called 911 and then phoned her husband to say, "It's time. I did it." Police who arrived at the scene were met not with a frantic, broken mother, but a woman detached, as though her mind had already accepted the twisted logic of her actions. This case shocked the nation, not only because of the crime itself, but because it forced the world to confront the devastating impact of untreated postpartum psychosis. Andrea Yates wasn't the caricature of an evil mother. She was a fragile woman trapped in a delusional war against herself, and 5 innocent children paid the price. The aftermath of Andrea Yates's actions was as complex as it was horrifying. In 2002, her first trial unfolded under the glare of national attention. Prosecutors painted her as a cold and methodical killer. They emphasized the calculated way she drowned her children one by one and then laid their bodies neatly on the bed, proof, they argued, that she understood exactly what she was doing. For the state, this was murder in its purest form, deliberate and merciless. The defense countered with an entirely different narrative. They described a woman ravaged by severe postpartum psychosis, trapped in delusion so powerful that she believed drowning her children was an act of salvation, sparing them from eternal torment. Psychiatric experts testified that Andrea was not evil but gravely ill, her mind fractured beyond recognition. But the jury was unconvinced. They found her guilty of capital murder, and the judge sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. Many felt justice had been served, but mental health advocates decried the verdict, arguing that punishing her as though she was sane ignored the devastating realities of her condition. Then came the twist. Years later, it was revealed that one of the state's star witnesses, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz, had given false testimony. He claimed Andrea might have modeled her defense after a fictional Law and Order episode where a woman drowned her children, but no such episode had ever existed. That revelation was enough to overturn her conviction in 2005. In 2006, Andrea Yates stood trial again. This time, the defense was stronger and more thorough. They laid bare her long history of psychiatric hospitalizations, suicide attempts, and explicit medical warnings that another child could trigger disaster. They described her religious delusions in vivid detail, convincing the jury that Andrea was not a calculating killer, but a profoundly psychotic woman whose illness had completely overtaken her. The jury agreed. They found her not guilty by reason of insanity. Instead of prison, Andrea was committed indefinitely to a high-security psychiatric facility in Texas. Today, she remains there, living a quiet, structured existence under constant supervision. She reportedly spends her time in therapy and art programs, even painting pieces that have been sold to raise money for mental health awareness. Each year, she has the legal right to request release, but she has consistently waived it, choosing to remain in treatment rather than risk another collapse. The Yates case changed the national conversation about mental illness and the law. It forced Americans to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the line between evil and insanity is not sharp, but blurred, and society must decide how to respond when tragedy emerges from that blurred space. In the quiet suburbs of Springfield, Missouri, the Stalter family seemed ordinary at first glance. Diane Stalter was a church organist. Her husband, Mark, played in a local band. And their children, Sarah, Sean, and Rachel, lived together under one modest roof. To outsiders, there was nothing unusual about the family. But behind closed doors, Diane harbored a chilling resentment that would turn deadly. On Easter Sunday in 2012, tragedy struck. Mark, then 61 years old, suddenly collapsed at home and died. Doctors found no signs of foul play and listed the cause as natural. Friends and neighbors gathered to support Diane, who appeared devastated. She spoke of her husband's poor health, and no one questioned the explanation. But the truth was far darker. Mark's Gatorade had been laced with antifreeze, administered slowly by the woman he trusted most. Just months later, grief struck again. Sean, Diane's 26-year-old son, was found dead in his bedroom. Sean had autism and lived with the family. Doctors attributed his sudden death to pre-existing conditions, and once more the family's losses were viewed as tragic misfortune. Diane received sympathy, but in her own mind, she had rid herself of what she described as burdens. The plan might have remained hidden, but in 2013 her daughter Sarah suddenly became gravely ill. She was rushed to the hospital with organ failure that baffled doctors. Sarah was in her 20s, vibrant and seemingly healthy. Her mysterious decline raised suspicions. The hospital notified authorities after finding traces consistent with antifreeze poisoning. The investigation soon uncovered a shocking truth. This was no coincidence. Detectives learned that Diane was not only behind the poisonings, but she hadn't acted alone. Her daughter Rachel, then 22, was complicit. She had known her mother had poisoned both her father and brother, and she admitted she had even helped plan the attempt on Sarah. What stunned investigators further was Diane's own written confession, her private journal, filled with bitter words about her family and dark poetry revealing her intentions. She wrote of her hatred for Mark, calling him lazy, and of Sean, whom she labeled a pest. These weren't fleeting thoughts. They were the careful record of a woman methodically erasing her own family. When confronted, Diane confessed with chilling detachment. She explained she had poisoned Mark and Sean to free herself from what she described as a miserable life. She admitted she had been slowly poisoning Sarah over the course of several days, also describing her as a burden. Rachel, facing her own charges, confirmed the details. She told detectives about conversations with her mother and how they had even joked about the plan. To prosecutors, the diary, the toxicology results, and the confessions painted a picture of a mother who had crossed into unfathomable cruelty, seeing murder as a solution to family frustration. Diane Stalter ultimately pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree assault. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rachel, who testified against her mother in exchange for leniency, received life sentences as well, though with the possibility of parole. Sarah, remarkably, survived the poisoning attempt. Though permanently scarred by the ordeal, she later spoke of her gratitude for the medical staff who saved her life. The Stalter case became infamous not just for its brutality, but for the cold rationality behind it. Diane wasn't driven by sudden rage or a psychotic break. She was calculating, deliberate, and disturbingly emotionless. A church musician and mother, outwardly ordinary, had turned her home into a house of death, using antifreeze as her weapon of choice. In the pastel suburbs of Springfield, Missouri, a pink house stood as a symbol of inspiration. It had been built by Habitat for Humanity for Claudine D.D. Blanchard and her daughter, Gypsy Rose. To neighbors, charities, and the thousands who followed their story online, they were the very picture of devotion. Dee was the tireless single mother. Gypsy was the eternally cheerful but tragically sick child, confined to a wheelchair, bald from supposed chemotherapy, her body weakened by a catalogue of illnesses. Leukemia, muscular dystrophy, seizures, asthma, Dee listed them all. The community embraced the story. Celebrities donated. Non-profits sponsored trips to Disney World. Doctors wrote prescriptions. And Gypsy smiled for photos, a frail miracle child with her heroic mother by her side. But beneath the surface, the miracle was a monstrous lie. Gypsy was not sick at all. She could walk, she could eat, she was not terminally ill. Every diagnosis had been fabricated by Dee, who had forced her daughter into a life of medical abuse to satisfy her own twisted craving for attention. For nearly 2 decades, Gypsy was subjected to unnecessary procedures. Feeding tubes, teeth pulled, surgeries that left scars on a healthy body. Dee shaved her daughter's head to make her appear like a chemotherapy patient. She lied to physicians, schools, neighbors, anyone who might question the inconsistencies. And whenever suspicion grew too strong, she packed up and moved, finding a new hospital, a new audience. To outsiders, Dee was selfless. To Gypsy, she was a captor. The girl lived as a prisoner inside her own body, bound not by illness, but by her mother's control. As Gypsy entered her teens, she began to grasp the truth. She could stand, she could run, she could dream of a life beyond the pink house. But every attempt at independence was crushed by Dee, who used physical punishment, manipulation, and fear to keep her obedient. Her only escape was the internet. Secretly, Gypsy created profiles on dating sites. And in 2012, she met Nicholas Godejohn, a man from Wisconsin with his own troubled past. Online, Gypsy found freedom. With Nicholas, she could be herself, a young woman desperate for love, not a sick child. Their conversations soon spiraled into fantasy and then into something darker. The belief that the only way to escape Dee's grip was to kill her. On the night of June 9th, 2015, the plan unfolded. Gypsy let Nicholas into the house while Dee slept. Gypsy hid in the bathroom, covering her ears, while Nicholas stabbed Dee to death. Afterward, the pair fled to Wisconsin, believing they had finally won their freedom. But the truth unraveled quickly. Days later, a bizarre Facebook post appeared on Dee Dee and Gypsy's shared account. "That beak is dead." Neighbors panicked, police were called, and when Dee Dee's body was discovered, the trail led straight to Gypsy and Nicholas. The world was stunned. A wheelchair-bound girl, the supposed victim of endless illness, walked into the police station on her own 2 feet. The deception was revealed in full. Dee Dee had never been a saint. She had been an abuser, orchestrating one of the most extreme cases of Munchausen by proxy ever documented. The courts faced a complex dilemma. Nicholas Godejohn was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. But Gypsy's role was viewed through a different lens. She had been manipulated, tortured, and stripped of her freedom for years. In a plea deal, she admitted to second-degree murder and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. By December 2023, Gypsy Rose was released on parole. Now in her early 30s, she has become a paradoxical public figure, a convicted killer, but also a survivor of horrific abuse. She shares her story widely, advocating for awareness of Munchausen by proxy, her case sparking debate about victimhood, justice, and the blurred line between survival and crime. Dee Dee Blanchard is remembered not as a devoted mother, but as the architect of a tragedy she created herself. And Gypsy Rose, the daughter who was once presented as fragile and broken, is now the survivor who broke free in the only way she thought possible. In Lawrenceville, Georgia, a quiet suburban apartment complex became the backdrop for one of the most horrifying child abuse cases in the state's history. The victim was 10-year-old Emani Moss, a little girl whose bright smile masked a life of torment, and at the center of her suffering was her stepmother, Tiffany Moss. To the outside world, Tiffany appeared to be a normal wife and mother. She lived with her husband, Emani Moss, and their 2 biological children. But behind the closed door of their apartment, a devastating contrast played out. Tiffany fed, clothed, and cared for her own children, while Emani was treated as less than human. Locked away in a bare room, denied food for weeks at a time, she slowly wasted away. The cruelty was deliberate. Prosecutors later revealed text messages and photos Tiffany had sent her husband, images of the meals she had cooked for their other children. These weren't innocent updates. They were reminders, taunts sent while Emani went hungry just a few feet away. For Tiffany, it was not enough to neglect her stepdaughter. It was important to watch her suffer. Emani's biological mother had lost custody years earlier, leaving the girl entirely in the hands of her father and stepmother. At first, teachers and social workers had noted concerns about Emani's health, but each time, Tiffany found ways to deflect scrutiny. By the fall of 2013, the abuse had escalated into full starvation. At only 10 years old, Emani's weight had dropped to a shocking 32 pounds, the average weight of a preschooler. Her organs could no longer sustain her. When Emani finally collapsed, Tiffany and her husband made a choice that pushed the crime into an even darker realm. Instead of calling for help, they panicked. Fearing discovery, they stuffed the child's body into a steel trash can, carried it outside, and attempted to burn her remains with charcoal. But their attempt at cremation failed. Maintenance workers later stumbled upon the can and alerted police, uncovering a crime so grotesque it shocked even seasoned investigators. Emani Moss quickly took a plea deal, admitting to his role in the cover-up. He was sentenced to life without parole, but agreed to testify against his wife. Tiffany Moss, however, faced her fate alone, and in a way that stunned the courtroom. When her capital murder trial began in 2019, Tiffany announced she would represent herself. No defense team, no cross-examinations, no witnesses. She sat silently as prosecutors laid out the gruesome details. Jurors saw photographs of Emani's emaciated body, heard testimony from medical examiners, and listened to heartbreaking recordings of the child's faint, desperate pleas. Tiffany stared ahead, expressionless. Her silence became her legacy. She offered no explanation, no apology, no sign of remorse. The prosecution argued that the silence was proof of indifference, evidence that she had always seen Emani not as a child but as a burden to erase. It took the jury less than 2 hours to convict her on all counts. During sentencing, the prosecution pushed for death. Again, Tiffany offered nothing in her defense. No mitigating evidence, no statement, not even an acknowledgement of her actions. The jury's decision was swift. Tiffany Moss was sentenced to death by lethal injection, becoming the only woman on Georgia's death row. As of 2025, she remains incarcerated at Arundel State Prison, awaiting her execution. Her husband, Emani, continues to serve his life sentence. And the story of Emani Moss endures as a chilling reminder of how cruelty can hide in plain sight, inside a home that should have been a place of safety. To friends and neighbors, Lori Vallow appeared like any other suburban mother. She was charismatic, attractive, and seemingly devoted to her two children, 16-year-old Caylee Ryan and 7-year-old Joshua J.J. Vallow, who had special needs. But beneath the surface, Lori's life had veered into an extraordinary and dangerous belief system, one that would end in tragedy. Her path changed when she met Chad Daybell, a self-published author of apocalyptic novels and self-proclaimed prophet. Chad was the leader of a fringe doomsday movement within the Mormon community, preaching that the end of the world was imminent and that certain chosen people would help lead the 144,000 faithful into salvation. Lori quickly became both his partner in faith and in life. Together, they adopted a theology that revolved around zombies. According to their doctrine, when a person was overcome by darkness, their spirit could be replaced by an evil entity. The only way to free that soul was to destroy the physical body. In July 2019, Lori's fourth husband, Charles Vallow, was shot and killed by her brother, Alex Cox. He claimed it was self-defense after a domestic dispute, and the case was initially closed. Just 3 months later, Chad's wife of nearly 30 years, Tammy Daybell, died suddenly in her sleep. At the time, her death was ruled natural and no autopsy was conducted. With their spouses gone, Lori and Chad were free to be together. But Lori still had two major obstacles: her children. In September 2019, both Caylee and JJ disappeared. The last known photo of Caylee was taken during a family trip to Yellowstone National Park. Days later, JJ was last seen at his elementary school before being abruptly withdrawn, with Lori telling administrators she would homeschool him. Family members quickly grew suspicious. When JJ's grandparents requested a welfare check in late November, police went to Lori's home in Rexburg, Idaho. She claimed JJ was visiting relatives in Arizona. Investigators quickly discovered that was a lie. More alarming, Lori's brother Alex, who had always been central to her life, died suddenly of what was later ruled natural causes in December 2019, removing a key witness. As questions mounted, Lori and Chad carried on with shocking indifference. Just weeks after Tammy Daybell's death, they flew to Hawaii and married in a beach ceremony, posing for smiling photographs while Lori's children were still missing. Detectives described the couple's behavior as chillingly detached, more concerned with their new life together than the whereabouts of two children who had seemingly vanished. The missing persons case exploded into a national story. Media outlets across the country covered Lori's evasive behavior and the bizarre cult-like beliefs she and Chad espoused. Under court order, she was told to produce her children by January 2020. She ignored the deadline. Shortly afterward, she was arrested in Hawaii and extradited to Idaho. As the months dragged on, hope for Caylee and JJ's safety dimmed. The story gripped the nation not just because of its horror, but because of its surreal mix of suburban life, fringe religious extremism, and calculated deception. Lori presented herself as a chosen prophetess preparing for the end times, but to investigators, the evidence pointed to a mother determined to erase any obstacle to her new relationship. And the truth, the devastating, undeniable truth, was still buried, waiting to be unearthed. The question haunted every news broadcast for nearly a year. Where are Caylee and JJ? Investigators followed every lead, every rumor, every false claim. Lori Vallow Daybell and her new husband, Chad Daybell, maintained a wall of silence. Even when Lori sat in jail on child abandonment charges, she smiled serenely in court, as if the storm outside had nothing to do with her. The breakthrough came in June 2020, when investigators returned to Chad Daybell's property in Rexburg, Idaho. Acting on cell phone location data from Lori's late brother, Alex Cox, they focused their search on the backyard. What they unearthed was beyond comprehension. Underneath freshly disturbed earth, investigators found human remains. First, they discovered JJ Vallow's body. The 7-year-old was buried in a pet cemetery plot, wrapped in trash bags, bound tightly with duct tape. He was still wearing his red pajamas, the same ones captured in the last photograph taken of him alive. Nearby, another grave revealed the remains of Caylee Ryan. Her body had been dismembered and partially burned, packed into a melted green bucket. Detectives said the level of destruction made the recovery one of the most disturbing scenes they had ever faced. The news broke live on television. Crowds outside the Daybell property sobbed as officials confirmed the unthinkable truth. The children hadn't been hidden away. They had been murdered and buried in the very yard where Chad and Lori had hosted church gatherings and barbecues. In the courtroom, prosecutors painted a chilling picture. They argued that the so-called zombie theology was not spiritual conviction but a convenient cover story. The real motives were simple and earthly: money, lust, and power. With Charles Vallow and Tammy Daybell gone, and Lori's children eliminated, the couple could collect insurance payouts, survivor benefits, and live the life they claimed destiny had promised them. The trial, which began in 2023, was surreal. Witnesses described how Lori calmly vacationed in Hawaii, while her children's whereabouts were questioned daily on national TV. Prosecutors presented text messages where she and Chad casually discussed dark spirits inhabiting JJ and Caylee. They called it coded language for planned murder. Lori sat in court, smiling, taking notes, at times laughing quietly with her attorneys. Not once did she show grief for her children. The jury deliberated less than 7 hours before returning a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder for both Caylee and JJ, and guilty of conspiracy to murder Tammy Daybell. The judge sentenced her to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Chad Daybell's trial is scheduled separately, where he faces the death penalty. As of August 2025, Lori Vallow Daybell is incarcerated in Idaho, serving out her sentence. For many, her case remains one of the darkest intersections of faith, delusion, and brutality in modern American crime. From the outside, Lacy Spears looked like a doting single mother. Her entire online presence revolved around her little boy, Garnet. Blogs, Facebook posts, and mommy forums were filled with updates about his supposed illnesses. She called him "my little prince" and shared photos of his frequent hospital visits, attracting sympathy and support from strangers who followed every update. But beneath the constant stream of attention, something far more sinister was happening. Prosecutors would later describe it as a textbook case of Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a psychological disorder where a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in a child for sympathy, validation, or control. By the time Garnet was 5, he had endured dozens of hospitalizations. Doctors struggled to explain the recurring seizures, unexplained fevers, and stomach issues. Lacy always seemed to know just when a crisis would strike, and she was always the first to update her online followers, turning every emergency into content. In January 2014, Garnet was admitted once again, this time to a hospital in Westchester County, New York. He was lethargic, vomiting, and unresponsive. Tests revealed shockingly high sodium levels in his blood, levels so extreme that doctors initially thought it was a lab error. But when retested, the results were the same. The medical team was baffled. Naturally occurring sodium spikes like that were virtually impossible without deliberate interference. As Garnet's condition worsened, suspicion turned toward his mother. Surveillance footage later confirmed it. Lacy was seen carrying a feeding tube into the hospital bathroom with her son, and returning alone. Minutes later, Garnet's monitors began to sound alarms. The boy slipped into a coma and never recovered. He died at just 5 years old, and the cause of death was clear: acute sodium poisoning. At trial, prosecutors argued that Spears had poisoned her son by injecting table salt directly into his feeding tube. They highlighted her digital trail, internet searches for dangers of salt in children, and how much salt kills. They painted her as a manipulative mother who craved sympathy and validation so much that she was willing to sacrifice her child's life for it. Lacy's defense team countered that Garnet's death was a tragic accident, pointing to his complex medical history. But the jury wasn't convinced. In 2015, Spears was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. The courtroom heard powerful statements from Garnet's relatives, who had long suspected something was wrong, but never imagined it would end this way. To this day, Spears shows little remorse, continuing to insist she never meant to harm her son. Her case serves as one of the most chilling modern examples of how the pursuit of online attention and sympathy can warp into something deadly. The disappearance of 2-year-old Caylee Anthony in Orlando, Florida, ignited one of the most sensational cases in American legal history. At the center was Caylee's mother, Casey Anthony, a 22-year-old whose shifting stories, erratic behavior, and contradictory evidence stunned investigators and transfixed the nation. In June 2008, Caylee was last seen alive at the home of her grandparents, George and Cindy Anthony. For weeks afterward, Caylee claimed that her daughter was staying with a babysitter named Zanny. But when Cindy finally called 911 in July, saying her granddaughter had been missing for 31 days, investigators realized something was gravely wrong. The supposed nanny did not exist. What baffled police even more was Caylee's behavior during the period when her daughter was allegedly missing. Instead of searching desperately or raising alarms, she was photographed partying at nightclubs, shopping, and even participating in a hot body contest. Detectives began to suspect they were not dealing with a grieving mother, but someone hiding a darker truth. Forensic evidence intensified that suspicion. Investigators seized Caylee's Pontiac Sunfire and immediately noticed a stench inside the trunk. A cadaver dog alerted to the smell of human decomposition. Technicians also discovered hair that was microscopically similar to Caylee's, along with residue suggesting the presence of chloroform. On the family computer, someone had searched for chloroform, neck breaking, and household weapons. Caylee continued spinning stories. She gave police a tour of Universal Studios, claiming she worked there, only to admit minutes later that it was a lie. Detectives described her as calm, detached, and disturbingly unconcerned. As the investigation widened, the focus shifted from finding a missing child to proving a homicide. In December 2008, a utility worker discovered skeletal remains in a wooded area, less than half a mile from the Anthony home. The small skull was wrapped in duct tape, and investigators confirmed it was Caylee. The autopsy could not determine an exact cause of death, but the duct tape became the cornerstone of the prosecution's argument. The discovery turned the case into a national obsession. Cable networks broadcast live coverage, experts debated endlessly, and the story dominated headlines. To prosecutors, the case was clear. Caylee killed her daughter to free herself from the responsibilities of motherhood and continue her carefree lifestyle. To defense attorneys, there was another explanation entirely, one they would reveal in the trial that followed. The trial of Caylee Anthony became known as the trial of the decade, not only for its shocking allegations but for the public frenzy that surrounded every hearing. Prosecutors laid out a narrative that Caylee's death was no accident. They argued Caylee wanted freedom from the burdens of motherhood and had intentionally silenced her daughter with chloroform, then applied duct tape before placing the toddler's body in a trash bag and abandoning her in the woods. They highlighted internet searches from the Anthony home computer: chloroform, how to break a neck, household weapons. In court, prosecutors displayed photographs of Caylee dancing at clubs during the very weeks Caylee was missing. Friends testified she seemed carefree, never mentioning her daughter. The state described this behavior as evidence of motive, a young woman prioritizing parties and boyfriends over her child. The defense, led by attorney Jose Baez, countered with an explosive theory. Caylee, they said, had drowned accidentally in the Anthony family's above-ground pool. In panic, George Anthony, Caylee's father, allegedly helped cover it up. They claimed the state had no conclusive evidence of homicide, no fingerprints on duct tape, no eyewitness, no definitive cause of death. Baez painted Caylee as a troubled young woman raised in a home filled with dysfunction and abuse, suggesting her lies were a symptom of lifelong trauma rather than proof of murder. One of the most contested pieces of evidence was the air samples from Caylee's trunk. Forensic specialists testified that chemical compounds indicated human decomposition. The defense argued the science was experimental and unreliable. Without a clear medical determination of how Caylee died, jurors were left with conflicting narratives: a mother who partied while her daughter was missing versus a family hiding a tragic accident. The trial stretched for 6 weeks in the summer of 2011, broadcast live on nearly every major network. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered daily, holding signs that read "Justice for Caylee" and shouting as Caylee was escorted in and out. It was reality television fused with criminal justice, and every detail became headline news. On July 5, 2000, Caylee Anthony was found not guilty of first-degree murder, not guilty of aggravated child abuse, and not guilty of manslaughter. She was convicted only on 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement. When the judge read the decision, gasps echoed through the courtroom and protests erupted outside. To many, it was the most shocking acquittal since the O.J. Simpson case. Caylee walked free after serving time for lying to police. Public reaction was furious. Legal analysts debated whether the state had overreached with a weak circumstantial case or whether the jury had ignored overwhelming suspicion. To Caylee's grandparents, the verdict was a devastating final twist in a family tragedy. Since then, Casey Anthony has lived largely in seclusion. She has given occasional interviews, insisting she does not know how her daughter died. To this day, her name sparks outrage. Her trial studied as a cautionary tale of media obsession, prosecutorial strategy, and the limits of circumstantial evidence. Because in the end, a little girl was lost, and no one was ever held criminally responsible for her death. In the quiet suburb of Pleasant Grove, Utah, a discovery in 2014 revealed a horror that had unfolded over nearly a decade. Darren West, recently released from federal prison on drug charges, returned to the house where his estranged wife, Megan Huntsman, still lived. While cleaning out the garage, he opened a box that seemed oddly heavy. Inside, wrapped in plastic, was the body of a newborn. Police were called immediately. What they found stunned even seasoned investigators. One by one, they uncovered more boxes and containers, each concealing the remains of an infant. In total, 7 tiny bodies were recovered. Huntsman initially tried to deflect blame, but soon admitted that 6 of the newborns were hers, and that she had deliberately ended their lives after giving birth in secret. The 7th, she claimed, was stillborn. Her reasoning? She said she was addicted to methamphetamine, overwhelmed, and didn't want the responsibility of raising more children. At the time, she already had 3 living daughters. Investigators pieced together a timeline. Between 1996 and 2006, Huntsman would conceal pregnancies, give birth alone at home, and then hide the infants in boxes, storing them in the garage as if they were forgotten belongings. Neighbors later told reporters they had suspected drug problems in the household, but never imagined such a hidden tragedy. The case rocked Utah, a state where family and faith are central to daily life. Prosecutors debated whether to pursue the death penalty. Ultimately, Huntsman avoided trial by pleading guilty in 2015 to 6 counts of murder. During sentencing, she described herself as a horrible person and admitted she didn't deserve forgiveness. She was sentenced to 6 consecutive terms of 5 years to life. The judge called her actions the greatest betrayal a mother could inflict. To this day, people in Pleasant Grove speak of the case in hushed tones. The house has since been emptied, but the garage where the boxes were found remains a haunting symbol of how secrets can fester unnoticed for years. Megan Huntsman, now serving her sentence at the Utah State Prison, will not be eligible for parole until she is an elderly woman. For many, that feels like too small a price for the loss of 6 lives, lives that never had the chance to begin. Across every case, one question lingers. Why? Why would a mother, the very person meant to protect, become the architect of destruction? The answers vary, but 3 themes surface again and again: romantic obsession, religious delusion, and simmering resentment. Romantic obsession often pulled the strings. Susan Smith's fabricated carjacking wasn't born from random cruelty, but from her desperate bid to hold on to a lover who rejected the idea of children. Diane Downs followed a similar path, firing bullets into her own kids because a man she obsessed over didn't want a ready-made family. In both cases, children became obstacles rather than blessings, reduced to bargaining chips and twisted quests for affection. Religious delusion carved another path to tragedy. Andrea Yates' belief that drowning her 5 children would save their souls revealed how fragile the line is between faith and fanaticism when warped by psychosis. Vallow Daybell's adoption of cult-like zombie theology pushed her into a reality where death was framed as deliverance. In these stories, distorted spiritual narratives cloaked catastrophic violence in a false sense of righteousness. Then there is resentment, slow, corrosive, and devastating. Diane Stalter poisoned her own family not out of passion or delusion, but because she saw them as obstacles to her comfort. Emani Moss starved her stepdaughter as punishment, a cruel extension of household control turned deadly. Megan Huntsman, gripped by drug addiction and despair, ended the lives of 6 infants over a decade because she believed she couldn't handle more responsibility. These motives weren't sudden. They simmered until resentment hardened into action. Yet, woven into all 3 themes is a chilling similarity, a collapse of empathy. Whether chasing romance, consumed by faith, or drowning in bitterness, each woman chose self over life. That collapse transformed ordinary homes into crime scenes and shattered communities that never imagined such horrors could emerge from within. When prosecutors summarized these motives in court, jurors often struggled. How do you weigh a mother's troubled past against the innocence of children who never had a chance? How do you reconcile mental illness, addiction, or emotional turmoil with acts so deliberate they left no survivors? The answer, more often than not, came in harsh sentences. But while justice may have been served, the motives still echo. A warning that love warped into obsession, faith twisted into delusion, or resentment left unchecked can all lead to unthinkable betrayal. If motives explain why, forensics explains how the truth finally emerged. Across these cases, the science, the witnesses, and the quiet details were the fulcrums that tipped suspicion into certainty. In South Carolina, it wasn't Susan Smith's tearful press conferences that unraveled her story. It was inconsistencies cross-checked with geography. Investigators traced her car's supposed route, compared it with witness timelines, and realized the pieces didn't fit. When divers pulled her Mazda from John D. Long Lake, with both children still strapped inside, the forensic evidence silenced every last lie. For Diane Downs, it wasn't just her shifting story that doomed her. It was the voice of her own daughter, Christy, who survived against all odds. In court, the child pointed at her mother and said she was the shooter. That single testimony, bolstered by ballistic evidence showing the bullets matched Downs' weapon, cracked open a case that had seemed clouded by theatrics and deflection. Andrea Yates' tragedy was framed by medical testimony. Psychiatric experts explained postpartum psychosis to jurors who struggled to comprehend how a mother could drown her 5 children in silence. The clash of psychiatric evaluations became the turning point, determining not only her fate, but also how the legal system views severe mental illness in criminal trials. For Diane Stalter, the revelation came from a diary. Her daughter Rachel's writings and statements exposed the family's antifreeze poisoning plot. Forensics confirmed it. Ethylene glycol traces in the victim's systems told the story of intentional, repeated doses. Without science, it might have been dismissed as coincidence. Gypsy Rose Blanchard's case flipped on digital evidence. Investigators pieced together Facebook posts, messages, and Nicholas Godejohn's confessions to create a timeline of manipulation and desperation. Forensic psychology reframed the case. Dee Dee's Munchausen, by proxy abuse, explained why Gypsy saw murder as the only exit. Tiffany Moss's silence in court said nothing, but the charred remains of Emani Moss said everything. Forensic pathologists documented starvation, malnutrition, and burns, details that jurors could neither unsee nor excuse. Vallow Daybell's zombie theology would have sounded like paranoia, if not for the shovels, the shallow graves, and the bodies of Caylee and JJ discovered in Chad Daybell's backyard. Forensic anthropology and DNA testing erased any chance of denial. And in New York, it was surveillance that caught Lacy Spears. Doctors suspected her stories, but hospital cameras showed her secretly administering salt to Garnett's feeding tube. The camera lens became the jury's eyes, cutting through years of manipulation. Every case in this dark archive hinged on a single pivot point, the moment where science, testimony, or a simple overlooked detail exposed the reality beneath the lies. These turning points remind us that while motive may be complex, the truth is often hiding in plain sight, on a lab slide, in a child's memory, or in the quiet hum of a hospital camera. Motherhood is often portrayed as the ultimate act of devotion, a bond unbreakable, a role defined by protection, sacrifice, and unconditional love. But these cases shatter that image. They are stories where the very symbol of safety became the source of destruction. From Susan Smith's submerged Mazda to Andrea Yates' silent bathtub, from Diane Downs' roadside shooting to Tiffany Moss's locked apartment, the pattern is chilling. The people society trusts most, mothers, weaponized that trust. And while the motives varied, the aftermaths converged in the same haunting truth. Some women, like Casey Anthony, walked free after the jury said, "Not guilty," only to live with the weight of suspicion forever. Others, like Megan Huntsman, sit in cells with life sentences, their confessions echoing back every day. Tiffany Moss remains one of the rare women on death row in America. Susan Smith, still in prison, continues to make headlines every time parole is mentioned, sparking outrage from those who remember the faces of her 2 sons. Andrea Yates, declared not guilty by reason of insanity, lives under psychiatric care. Her case a reminder that mental illness can twist even the most fundamental human instincts. Diane Downs still insists on her innocence, even as her daughter Christy's words remain one of the most unforgettable testimonies in courtroom history. And then there are the cases that linger in cultural memory for reasons beyond the crime itself. Gypsy Rose Blanchard, once seen only as a killer, has since been reframed in the public eye as a victim turned survivor. Lori Vallow Daybell's name is now tied to cult fanaticism, her trial a collision of religion, delusion, and greed. The forensic breakthroughs, whether it was a diary, a child's testimony, hospital surveillance, or shallow graves, proved again and again that the truth has a way of rising. But the emotional scars remain, communities shaken, families destroyed, children lost. What makes these stories resonate is not just the horror of the crimes, but the contradiction they represent. A mother's hand is supposed to guide, not harm. A parent's love is supposed to heal, not end. And yet, in these dark chapters of history, those roles were inverted in the most devastating ways. Today, these names serve as cautionary tales, etched into documentaries, news specials, and public memory. They force us to wrestle with the question, what happens when the very person who is supposed to be your shield becomes your executioner? It's a betrayal deeper than most crimes because it cuts at the very foundation of human trust. And perhaps that's why these cases remain unforgettable, because they remind us of both the fragility of innocence and the resilience of truth.